What's up, everybody? Today I'm doing an event report on the robot battles at Florida Supercon 2017, held in Fort Lauderdale, Florida on July 29th and 30th. This was a very different event in terms of layout from ones I've been to in the past because the robot fights was kind of a sideshow exhibition at a much larger convention. And I'll go into details about the event itself a little later, but I will say up front, it worked out a lot better than I ever would have anticipated, and it was a lot of fun. So, per kinda usual lately, I competed with my 150 gram bot Little Demon and my 3-pound robot Demon Spawn. Then I carried over F13 from its hockey bot version from Clash of the Bots into a thwack bot version to compete in the 15-pound weight class. So, per usual, we'll go through all the robots and talk about their fights and how they did. Usually in these kind of videos, I just pick a robot and talk about its fights in the order the fights happened, outside of the context of the event as a whole. This time I'm going to try talking about the fights as they happened, because, quite honestly, the amount of repairs I had to do at this event kind of informed some of the other stuff that happened. So, first off, Demon Spawn went up against French Revolution, a robot I'd fought previously with Sawin, but I think it's gotten quite a few upgrades since that match. It looked very different. And in this match, I think they found every single one of the weak spots on my robot and completely exploited it. One problem with Demon Spawn right now is that it has a hard time starting up. I think the weapon's just a little too heavy and the motor has a hard time getting going at first. So as the fight started, I was a little more vulnerable to their weapon as I was working to get my weapon going. We traded a few head-to-head blows, but I believe Demon Spawn's chassis once again started flexing despite me putting a titanium plate in it this time to try to make it a little more rigid. And after a very short while, I was unable to really control any of my driving. It looked like I was moving on my own accord, but I think a lot of it had to do with the weapon spinning and being a little bit unbalanced and making the robot kind of jitter around the arena. So French Revolution continued to attack and ended up taking the cap of one of my wheel hubs and was able to move around and get to the sides of my robot since I didn't really have much control. And eventually they performed a dual wheelectomy on Demon Spawn, which at this point didn't really affect any of its movement since it was still just kind of shuddering around the arena anyway, but it was obvious that I had no means of mobility, so I was counted out. They did do a fair amount of damage. They actually ripped off the front of this titanium plate. It's only 1 millimeter thick, but they actually did take a nice chunk out of it here. They once again broke one of the bolts that I had holding the weapon teeth, and I'd actually switched over to titanium bolts for this event, but even with titanium, they were still able just to shatter it and shear it in half. I think the weapon needs a redesign so that that doesn't happen anymore. You can kind of see back here, the wheels are coming apart. Actually, this one looks totally toast. Now that I move it, you can see there's nothing really in there holding it together. And then the back plate here, there's a very visible line right where their weapon hit. This back plate was bent in like an S shape by the time the fight was over. I did bend it back to a more flat shape, but the UHMW sides held up decently. There's really not more than a little bit of scuffage here, but it really just ended up being the exposed wheels that did me in. Now after the fight, I went and checked on my motors and found that neither of them were actually working. I ended up having to rebuild both of the gearboxes to get Demon Spawn ready for its next fight. One of the gears actually lost a tooth somewhere in the match. Fortunately, I did have some spare gearboxes for the Kitbots motors, so I was able to make a swap over and have 2 working wheels for the next fight. The next fight was a 15-pound match, so my robot F13 went up against Shake 1, I believe. It's the smaller version of Shake that Luke has, and Team X threw in a little helper bot as well. And I wish I could say this fight was a little more exciting, but unfortunately I think we both had some issues. I did get a nice little hit on the multi-bot, which is really just like a little toy that was thrown in. I did get a nice little slice on that one. I did accidentally put a little bit of a scuff in the Lexan with the machete as well, but not long into the fight, one of my sides of drive locked up and I was only able to really move in a circle, which doesn't really help with a thwack bot. Then Shake ended up having a very similar issue, and I think Shake just eventually ground to a halt, and I still had 1-wheel drive and just barely survived the fight. When I got this thing back to the pits, I found out that both drive motors were completely locked up. Obviously, the one side that had stopped functioning was locked, but the other side was just barely moving, was having a lot of trouble turning. So I ended up taking these gearboxes apart as well. I think maybe I must have put the screws holding the clutch in a little too deep on the drill motors, and they ended up somehow getting tightened during the fight and bottomed out and just locked up the motors. So I was able to get everything back and working, but between Demon Spawn's 2-motor reconstruction and F13's motor reconstruction, there's a lot of of times would be spent reassembling gearboxes in the pits and doing a lot of repairs. So Demon Spawn's next fight against Carnage from Team X. Unfortunately, I believe this was the fight when I turned the robot on. A nice plume of smoke started shooting out of Demon Spawn. During the fight with French Revolution, I also had one of my speed controllers ripped away from the motor, and the wires were actually torn out of the board, and in my attempts to repair it, I ended up soldering it poorly and smoked the board once power was given to it. Fortunately, Jim was there with his Robot Marketplace boxes of parts, and I was able to get a new speed controller and pop it in the robot and go ahead with the fight. The fight was pretty quick. Carnage was redone this event with a vertical spinner, which I love because I'm a sucker for vertical spinners. We kind of tried to get in a good position to hit each other. Eventually went head to head, and I hit just off to the side of his weapon, and I think I took a nice chunk out of his base plate, flipped him over. I was going to try to get back around and hit him again and flip him back over so we could fight more, but my mobility was still kind of iffy, and I just wasn't able to actually bring the weapon in and hit him again in a way that would flip him back on his wheels. So that really sucked. I wanted the fight to go on a little longer than it did, but it ended up being a quick knockout for Demon Spawn. My last fight of day one was Little Demon versus Skeeter from Hell, a compact little carbon fiber printed wedge. And as soon as the match started, I had very, very little mobility. I ended up finding out later that there was a short in my electronics that was basically causing all of my power to drop to the drive motors. And it would kind of come and go. I guess as I got hit, things got pushed around. So I'd have mobility for a little bit, and then I'd lose mobility. The weapon was able to continue to spin the whole time at what seemed like full power, but without much drive, I was never really able to bring the weapon to bear, and I got shoved around the arena a lot. I actually almost got shoved in the pit in the very first seconds of the match. Eventually, I managed to get one good hit in on Skeeter from Hell and flip myself over in the process, and found myself unable to move, which is weird because this robot should work inverted, so I was kind of confused. So after the match, I took a look at the robot, and, well, this isn't actually the robot. This is the leftover corpse of the first Little Demon that was in there. As you can see, the layers split on the weapon mount, so the entire weapon had actually come off of the robot when it landed upside down. So after a day of doing tons and tons of repairs to my other two robots, I now found myself having to move the guts of this robot into a completely different chassis. So in day two, Demon Spawn's first fight was up against Dead End, yet another very powerful horizontal bar spinner. And also another one I had fought with Salwin and saw firsthand how destructive it could be, that had also gotten upgrades in the meantime. So this fight definitely did not go as planned. After doing all the work on the drive, I was still having some mobility issues that I was unable to pinpoint. I was able to go weapon to weapon with him a few times, was able to toss him a little bit, and eventually we had one giant collision that flipped Demon Spawn, and in the process ejected one of the motors. It looks like my gearbox reconstruction had some issues, and I guess the motor just wasn't able to hang on any further. So the motor itself disconnected from the gearbox and flung itself somehow through the top of the robot. And I know I have some gaps in that armor, but I didn't think they were that bad. Which probably means the frame is flexing on impact more than I thought it was. My weapon ground on the floor a little bit. I was kind of hoping it might throw me back over, but eventually the belt was thrown off the pulley and I ended up being dead in the water. So after that, I think Demon Spawn is a design that has some potential. I think it needs to be refined a lot to be as competitive as I want it to be. So I'm going to keep working on it, keep trying to make it work better. Eventually have a whole new weapon system built because there are definitely inherent flaws with the way these teeth are designed, but hopefully one day I'll get it working the way I want it to. Next up was F-13 against Isotellus Rex, another really solidly built little wedge bot. Looked almost the exact same size and vague shape as Shake did, but this was just a straight up powerful wedge, I think with brushless drive in it as well. There's really not much a Thwackbot can do to a wedge, so all I did was just start swinging the machete as wildly as possible overhead, and my thought was, well, if he gets under me and my machete's coming down, the judges will have to just figure out if him wedging me or me hitting him with a machete gives us more points. So I was just kind of going on pure blind hope that I'd rack up enough random hits with the blade that I'd take the fight. At some point, he ended up backing into me, and we managed to get over to the wall, and somehow through the weird motions of this robot, I actually was able to flip him upside down, which I never expected to happen at all. And as the fight progressed, I got him over near the pit. I think he must have been having some driving issues or something because he wasn't really able to get away from it, and I actually was able to dump him in the pit and win the match by knockout. Once again, something I was not expecting to be able to accomplish. Little Demon's second fight was up against that purple thing, another Team X bot, and another little short wedge, and once again, there was very little I could do. My mobility was still hindered after that first fight. I managed to sort out the shorting issues, but it seems somewhere between the pits and throwing it in the arena, I screwed something up and lost the side of drive. I postponed the match. I thought I fixed the issue, threw it back in the arena, and was still missing a side of drive. I decided just to go ahead and run the match because I'd already taken the postponement. So it was a lot of me crab walking, trying to get to a place where I could actually hit the wedge, and then the wedge just scooping me up and throwing me into the walls. And after a little while, I ended up actually losing my one good wheel and was nothing more than a sitting duck to be pushed around the arena until I was counted out. So a very unsuccessful run for Little Demon. This whole redesign of the robot had been to make it more competitive against wedges, but obviously I have not accomplished that, so I'm gonna have to go back to the drawing board on it. Next up was F13 versus Shaboombox, and no offense to anybody else I fought at the event, but this was my absolute favorite fight of the whole weekend. Shaboombox has that very powerful lifting arm, and the kind of shovel blade he has on there is almost exactly the width of F13, so he was really just able to pick the robot up and throw him all around the arena like crazy. I ended up in the pit very early on in the fight, but he actually pulled me back out with that lifting arm so that we could continue the match. My strategy was really no better than it was against Ellis Rex. I just kept slamming the machete down as much as I could. Eventually Shaboombox picked up F13 and threw that machete right at my face. Thankfully the Lexan was in between. I can actually even see in the video that I jumped back away from the machete because that was a little startling even with the Lexan there. And eventually I ended up back in the pit and couldn't get back out. Once this robot's complete and has its hinged wedge, I probably won't be able to fit into that pit anymore, or it'll be very difficult to end up in that pit. But as it stands right now, if it's pushed sideways, it can very easily drop a wheel in there, and the other wheel is high up in the air and can't help get back out. So I am still a little vulnerable to that as well. And as you can see, there is some gaffer tape there at the bottom of the blade. That was really the only thing I could do as a repair after this match. The weld I had between the brackets and the machete had broken on one side. So I just added some tape in the hope that it would hold on just enough to continue fighting. So F13's final fight was once again against Ellis Rex in the semifinals, and I just decided to go with my same strategy again, just to keep smacking him with the machete and hope something good happens. I did try to take advantage when I could to try to push him around from the side. You know, in a head-to-head pushing match, he would mop the floor with me every time, but I thought maybe if I get around to the side of him, I can get him back over to the pit. I kind of just slammed around the arena for a little while. At one point, he ended up getting his wedge stuck under the sidewall, but there was a one free unstick rule, so they got him pulled back out. And shortly after, I ended up back in the pit again. I was first in kind of a position where I could have maybe gotten out, but then he kind of pushed me further in the pit and it was hopeless. I was stuck with one wheel mostly off the ground, and the machete was hitting the wall at such an angle that I couldn't really get back out of the pit. After all that, F13 ended up taking third place, which is pretty exciting. I had a lot of fun driving this robot. When the fights were over, I wasn't so much upset that I lost, but more upset that I couldn't play with this thing anymore because I was just having a blast, slamming the machete against the ground, putting on a show. It seemed like the crowd enjoyed it as well, for as much chaos as it invoked. Next time, I'm definitely going to get the wedge running on this thing. I'm actually going to take it up to Dragon Con, so the machete has to come off and the wedge can go on. And I also want to mark the top of the robot in something a little more obvious. There is kind of a little bit of silver to indicate which side is up because of the hinge on the front, but in the heat of battle when I'm near that pit, it's kind of hard to tell if I'm right side up or upside down and what the controls are going to do if I move in a certain way. So I need to give myself that little added advantage so that I don't accidentally move myself more into the pit instead of getting out. So those were the robot fights at Florida Supercon. I have to say, I had an absolute blast. It was a really fun event. As always, great people, and it was just super enjoyable overall for me. So big thanks to Paul and Will for putting on the event. And the way it ran, I actually thought was really cool because we did half an hour of fights at the top of every hour. And I think for a con audience that worked pretty well when we were able to maintain it because it was easy to be like, hey, we'll be fighting in half an hour, so go around the con, get an autograph, whatever, and just come back and you can see some robot fights. I think that really helps as opposed to other events where there's spectators and they see nothing going on and nobody's quite sure when it's going to start back up and they just kind of wander away and maybe don't come back. And it seemed like we had a lot of good traffic through there as well. We were in the very far back corner of the convention center, but there definitely were a lot of people coming by and watching and getting excited about it. I also have to say one of my favorite things with F13 is I had this pool noodle safety cover over the blade so I could have it a little more safe in the pits. And when I put it in the arena, I basically pull the cover off and just let the blade thud on the floor. And that always seemed to get a great reaction out of the crowd. So that made the robot even more enjoyable to drive and compete with. So my next event right now is Dragon Con up in Atlanta, Georgia at the beginning of September. And there's no 150 gram weight class, so Little Demon is definitely sitting that one out. Demon Spawn is going to get repaired, rebuilt a little bit. I've got to try to figure out where the heck this warping issue is coming from and find some way to stabilize the robot and make it less prone to twisting on impact. And hopefully that will make it a little more competitive. Probably some bigger wheels as well. Maybe some wheel guards if weight allows. And then F-13, as I already mentioned, has to be rebuilt a little bit before Dragon Con. The robot itself is still in good running order, but the larger weight classes at Dragon Con compete on kind of a sumo style arena where it's just a raised platform and try to push your opponent off. So I don't want that machete coming at me off that platform. I don't think anybody else does too. So the machete's gonna go. A wedge is gonna be added that's hinged around the wheels. That was intended for this event. I just didn't have time to finish it. And I think I might just replace the machete for this event with a pool noodle, and instead of calling it F-13 based off the Friday the 13th franchise, hence the machete, I'll switch it over to the Florida Pool Noodle Massacre for an event. So I know that'll be fun. Dragon Con's always a great time, and I may try to throw together an ant weight just to have something else to compete with and be stupid. So that's it for Florida Supercon, and I'll see you guys in the next event report.